Everybody. Hope you're all doing well in our new reality here. I'm here. I wanted to spend some time talking to you about classroom assessments, and then we're going to be talking about standardized assessments. And all of this is just trying to prepare us for the guest speaker that we're going to have next Wednesday. We're going to have a synchronous class. And when we have that class, I'll send you an invite. But we're going to be speaking with somebody who comes from a school that uses a lot of assessment and assessment techniques to identify students who need who need reteaching, who maybe need some supplemental instruction, who maybe need to be challenged beyond where they're at. And so we'll be looking at that. For today, though, I'm just going to spend some time looking at and reviewing the idea of assessments that are happening in the classroom. Assessments in the classroom really should be happening for three really important reasons. The first one is to motivate your students to learn. The second one is to offer feedback on student learning. And the third one is to offer feedback on teaching. And, really, as students, probably most of us have experienced the assessment for number two. And really very underleveraged is this idea that you can have high interest assessments that can motivate your students, or that there are times when you need to look at the assessments in terms of looking at what you may or may not have been doing in your own teaching. When I was a instructional coach, I couldn't tell you how many times I would sit down with teachers and they would be disappointed with the students' performance on a assessment, and we would sit down and we would look, and we would see a clear disconnect between what they wanted the students to do and what they actually were doing to prepare the students for that assessment. And so sometimes, it's important for us to remember that we also have to look at our own techniques and our own sort of role in student non-performance. I won't say failure because growth mindset and everything. I think that failure is a chance for us to learn and maybe improve our own teaching craft. So, what does the research say about testing? Frequent testing increases retention, and really this is assessing. Frequent testing increases retention of learning. Ongoing testing, such as pretest, promote learning, and cumulative questions that require students to build off of previous learning are very effective. So when you think about really good teaching strategies, you want to be giving students frequent assessments. You want those assessments to help you to be able to see before and after instruction whether or not a student has learned, and you want to connect your assessments one to the other so that the skills that they practice in the beginning of the year continue to be important even as they move to the end of the year. So high quality assessments have to have certain things. The first thing they have to have is validity. High quality assessments have to be able to, you have to be certain that they're measuring what you want them to measure. So that means, do they include the content and the skills that were under evaluation? That sometimes sounds simpler than it actually is, because let's take for instance the state testing right now for third grades. The constructive response in the reading test is actually something that the students sit down and type. And there are a lot of people that argue that that test is actually not measuring the students' reading. In the third grade, it's actually maybe reading. It might be testing their fine motor skills because of the fine motor skills that are required for keyboarding. Might be testing their exposure to technology, which for some students in some schools is going to be greater than other schools. So you can see why we have to make sure that the content and the skills that we want to evaluate are actually what we are evaluating. The other thing we have to think about is, to what extent does performance on a test align with the content that's being measured? Meaning, if I want to make sure that my students are able to assess or create a good argument, I better make sure that they have an authentic opportunity to create such an argument, rather than kind of creating a test that sort of kind of maybe gets to that skill. The reliability, I need to make sure that, looking at that idea of writing and constructing your own argument, reliability is consistency of measurement. Am I actually measuring one child the same way as I'm measuring the other child, which obviously is much more difficult in constructed responses like an essay than it would be like a right and wrong math question. But that's why we have things like rubrics and answer keys and things like that, because we want to make sure that we're being reliable. We want to make sure that generalizability, meaning that the performance on the test actually does indicate the performance in other contexts. So if I'm measuring their ability to apply an equation in math class, am I pretty certain that they can apply that equation in science and maybe in a real world setting as well? And the last one, we want to make sure that it's free of bias. We want to make sure that the students, that there's a level playing field, that our students, this is, a real challenge when you have an ELL student and you're trying to measure their performance in math or science. They may know the content, but it may not be easy for them to be able to demonstrate their knowledge of that content. When we're assessing in the classroom, we really have two different types of assessments that we want to look at, informal versus formal. And we immediately go to the formal, but I actually think that the informal for us as teachers is where like the money is. It's where the really, really important information is. Informal assessments are observations and evaluations that you gather from just sitting and watching your students. You might take things like observational notes. You might ask students things like, do you get it? Thumbs up, thumbs down, and be able to see whether or not, who says that they don't got it, whether or not the students are demonstrating that they understand it, how many people are actually participating. You might ask them exit slips. These are not things that you're going to put into the grade book necessarily, but these are just chances for you to be able to see where are they with their learning. Formal assessments include data. They're much more structured, and they include classroom assessments, standardized assessments, and district assessments. So these are all the things, when we talk about assessments, these are probably the things that come to your mind. So what's our purpose in assessing? Really, we want to assess. We don't want to assess just, a lot of people don't understand, a lot of teachers don't understand the purpose of assessment. It's really a cycle. It's not okay to assess, find out who's failing, and just leave it at that, like, oh, well, I guess I didn't get it, and move on. Really, we assess because we have a set of goals and outcomes. We want our students to be able to master. For us, it's going to be our standards, right? We want our students to be able to master the third grade standards or the sixth grade standards or the eighth grade social studies standards. So we develop and implement strategies. So we're going to do testing. We're going to, first we're going to do classroom activities that prepare them for the test. We're going to give them the test. We're going to look at our findings. So the next step is to review our findings. And then the piece that's really important is it's not just I'm going to give, assign a grade in the grade book and be done. It's about creating an action plan. If I find out a segment of my students, 15-20% of my students didn't master that standard, what am I going to do to help them to master that standard? How am I going to move on rather than just saying, okay, now tomorrow we're going to be talking about World War II. We're done with the Depression. We're on to World War II. But if I notice that my students didn't understand something important about the previous unit, what am I going to do rather than just move on in my teaching? So when we use formative assessment, the importance of formative assessment is that that's going on, that's happening throughout. I had an experience with my son when he was in ninth grade, and it was really hard because he actually attended the school where I was teaching at. When he was in ninth grade in a science class, he did multiple practice worksheets on finding mass. In all of those worksheets, he made the same error. He did probably 4 or 5 days worth of homework. She never checked it. So that when he got to the end test and he did poorly on the end test that happened at the end of the unit, he was making the same mistake that he had made throughout. And so when she and I sat down to talk and she was sharing with me the, error, and she was even showing me that this error had been done throughout the entire unit, I looked at her like, what was the point of doing the homework unless it was to identify the problem and then to help him to fix it before he got to that end assessment? So I think that's really important. And so formative assessments are there to guide your teaching and planning, and help you to improve instruction, help you to improve the learning, so that by the time you get to the summative, everybody is ready. And the purpose of summative assessment then is to let you know the level of accomplishment that's been attained by your students. So teachers need to look at, the role of testing in their classrooms, but we know that tests definitely are going to be part of your classroom. We know that there are a lot of tests that are available through most programs, a lot of curriculum, a lot of textbook Textbook companies will offer assessments for their teachers to use. But we also know that teachers often want to be able to create their own. So teacher-made assessments. It's important, though, if you do decide to use teacher-made assessments, that you think about you think about how to write a really good test. Most people don't recognize or understand that, a standardized test, it actually has a multiple year development where questions are written and they're actually vetted for multiple rounds to make sure that they actually have the validity and the reliability that we were talking about in the previous screen. We don't have that luxury when we're teaching in our own classrooms and we're creating our own objective tests at the end of a unit. So we want to at least adhere to some of the most important best practices for writing our own assessments. So the first thing is, one type of test that we want to think about is objective tests, and these are fast. You probably are going to use them quite a bit because you can ask the students a couple of objective questions very quickly and continue on with your lesson. They actually make good formative assessments because of the ease with which they can be given. But it's really kind of interesting, even in the most basic objective tests, you might find out that your students actually know more than you anticipated or expect they did. Years ago, I did a objective test with my students, with my 10th graders. It was a really hard close reading test. And there was about 10 questions, and I would give it to them, and I would see them, 10 multiple choice questions, and I'd see them groaning and being upset. And I did this every year, and I would step back and go, this is really tough. Yeah, would you like to take this together? And I actually had them. I picked like the squirreliest kid, and I asked that squirreliest kid, I want you to go to the front of the room, and I want you to kind of build consensus. You're the leader, and I'm going to have you guys, all 25 of you are going to take this test together. And then they would go through the questions together one by one. And what was amazing to me is that many of them got to right or to wrong answers with correct thinking, meaning they understood the reading, they understood the characters, they understood the theme. They approached a question in a different way than I approached it. And so we want to be careful with objective tests because they do have some limitations. And those limitations are more profound if we construct the objective tests in ways that are wrong. So objective tests then, not open to interpretation. There are things like true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blanks, and matching. Reality is almost nothing is actually not open to interpretation, because a lot of it has to do with how we read the question. But there are some ways that we can make sure that we're building reliability in our test. For multiple choice questions, we want to think about multiple choice questions in two ways. The STEM is the part that asks the question, and the distractors are all of the wrong answers. And so when we are constructing a good multiple choice question, we want to make sure our STEM is accurate, and we want to make sure that our distractors are appropriate. So there's some guidelines that we want to consider. And at this point, I just explained, you do have a worksheet, and I know I'm not going to grade it or whatever, but it's got some examples. And what you're going to ask when I ask you to do is see if you can identify the error. What did the teacher do wrong when they were creating that question? So some of the things to think about with STEMs and distractors are, you want to make sure that your STEM is clear and short as possible. Your students need to know what you're asking them to find out. You want to make sure that your STEMs really only present a single problem. You could take it in multiple step, perhaps, but ask a related question as a follow-up. Make sure that you're only asking them a single question. Problem asked in the STEM needs to be stated as a positive. So don't want to ask them a bunch of which adjective does not relate to the character, things like that. There should not be just a little fine discrimination in the distractors. There needs to be an obvious, if a student says that somebody is sneaky, but I was looking for them being maybe untrustworthy, is that really all that big of a difference? I want to improve clarity, so I want to make sure that my wording in the STEM doesn't repeat phrases in each of the choices. I want to be, as succinct as possible. I want to make sure that they're grammatically correct so that there's no answer that is grammatically incorrect, because my students will learn pretty quickly that if it's grammatically incorrect, it's probably the wrong answer. I want to avoid things like always, all, never, categorical words, because they really can confuse things like,
well, she didn't do that, but does that mean that she never would do that? Those types of questions. You want to avoid using two distractors with the same meaning. You want to avoid using exact wording from the text. You don't want to overuse the all of the above or none of the above as possible answers, and you want to watch that you don't have obvious patterns, like all your questions aren't C, which is sometimes what happens to me. Um, so what I have for you, and you can download it, is a little worksheet, and the worksheet's going to have things like this. It's going to have a question, and the question here is going to ask you to decide or to tell me what is wrong with this particular question. So the first question of the following is not a standard score. Okay. Did you notice that this particular question asked the sum in a negative way? Not was, it's best to say to avoid using that. If you do in fact use not, you need to underline it or boldface it or make it very evident. Okay. All right. The next kind of objective test that you might use as a teacher is a true false. And true false items are actually very, very tricky. So you want to make sure that your statements are clear and ambiguous. You want to make sure that there's only one idea being judged, true or false. And you want to make sure that words such as most, some, sometimes, possibly, may, usually, always, never, all, and none are avoided. Um, words that are words that identify what is wrong, and so that then what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to identify what is wrong with a set of true false questions. And for instance, here's an example from your set. There are 6 stages of moral development, true false. The problem with that is I'm not being specific enough. It's very ambiguous for me because whose theories are multiple theories of moral development? Are you talking about Kohlberg? If you're talking about Kohlberg, the answer is true. If you're talking about some other theorists, the answer might be false. Okay? And then the next one, the next kind that I didn't give you an example here because I only have 2 sets to look at, is matching. And you want to make sure that you match the best items are those where the same answers can be used several times. The phrasing of stems and answers should match. There should only be about 10 items in the list, and you should keep the list on the same page. So those are some things that you want to look at. So in the handout that I gave you 2 matching sets, and I asked you to identify how would you correct if this was, something that you were using in your own classroom. How might you improve that matching set? One that I didn't give examples just because I don't find these particularly useful is fill in the blanks. Fill in the blanks really should only be used sparingly because they're really only good for lower level thinking. And there's a real problem because there's a lot of potential for correct answers. A student might put things into their own words, and which is actually, good reading is being able to summarize something in your own way. But you might have written it exactly from the text, and so the student might have the right thinking. Back to the example that I was telling you earlier, the right thinking, even if they have technically the wrong answer. So filling in the blanks is it's not an objective test that I suggest that you do. So, here's some examples. The blank war lasted from blank to blank. Too vague. I mean, we want to talk about what war lasted. The Civil War lasted from blank to blank. John Steinbeck won the Pulitzer Prize for blank, blank, and blank. Well, those are what you're probably putting there are novels, but really, how important is it that the students know novels? Plant cells have what? Plant cells have a lot of things, so it's just way too vague. And blank was assassinated in 1963. Again, there's probably multiple people. Even though I know the answer is JFK that they're looking for, there are probably other world leaders who were assassinated in 1963. So objective tests are nice. They're quick. There's something that you're probably going to use quite a bit. But if you really want to get to your students' thinking, you're probably going to want to consider using constructive responses. And constructive responses are things like essays, diagramming or explaining a math answer, performances, exhibitions, and portfolios. So these are all things that you're going to do. The advantages to this is they really, really allow you to get to the students' thinking. Disadvantages are going to be that they're going to be a lot harder for you to grade. You can't do these quickly. So here is an example of a constructive response prompt. Defend or refute the following statement. Civil wars are necessary to the growth of a developing country. Cite reasons for your argument and use examples from history to substantiate your claim. So those are, going to be really tricky for you to be able to consider. And when you get there, you have to think about, how you're going to grade that. Actually, grading for all of assessment, one of the things teachers have to do is how am I going to take all of this numerical data that I'm getting, both in my constructed responses and from my objective testing, and how am I going to turn this into a grade, right? How am I going to decide whether or not my students are, in fact, meeting my standards, okay? Some of the things that you might consider as a teacher is criterion reference grading, which means that you list all of the things that you want a student to do. You'll see a lot of early elementary report cards actually look like this, like able to identify letters, able to identify both capital and lowercase letters. So you get these different criteria and you get checks and you find out exactly what the students are able to do and what they're not able to do. Another thing that you might consider, and this is more in a standardized testing, it kind of would suck to do it in your grade report, but another thing is norm reference, which means that the grade represents a student standing in comparison to their peers. Percentages and points is probably the one that we're most kind of familiar with. And another thing that we might consider would be a contract, like this is what you need to do to earn an A in this class, this is what you need to do to earn a B. That might be something that you would do in something like for a reading class, like maybe students read and take so many AR tests for a certain grade, things like that. All right, so planning ahead, you're gonna check Leo. So on Leo, I have just 3 really short, they're 60-minute examples of teacher assessments, and then the worksheet on objective tests. I want you to download the worksheet, take the worksheet, I want you to watch the 3 videos, and then I want you to write a 1/2 page to 1 page reflection in which you discuss what the lecture, meaning this video, the worksheet and the videos demonstrated to you about the teacher's role in assessing students and why they matter. Be sure that you're offering specific examples in your responses so that I can see that you did the work, and this will be due at the beginning of class on Monday. I will be sending out an email invite for you for Michael Acomb is going to be coming. He is the principal of Dorothy E. Lewis Elementary School in Solon, and he's going to speak on Wednesday about data-informed instruction. I will send out the invite. I highly suggest that you attend if you can. I will try to video it so that you can watch it on your own, but Michael Acomb is from Solon is by far the most advanced school district in the area for use of assessment. They kind of lead the pack, and it's really important that you understand his experience is sort of really innovative for this area. And you might not necessarily agree with everything that they're doing in Solon. I have my reservations, if I'm being honest, but it's really important, I think, because this isn't a trend that you're really going to be looking at that's going to impact your teaching career. And then the last thing is we will begin planning for Teach Like a Champion project. By Friday, I will have everything up, hopefully even earlier. I'll send an email, but under the major assessments tab, I'm working right now on how to modify this assignment given our new reality, what's fair and what to do with that. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me, but I will be in touch with all of you. Take care.